Hi guys, can I ask for a favor? If you enjoy listening to the show, please give us a review on Apple Podcasts. It could really help the show to be discovered by more listeners. For the cost of less than a cup of coffee per month, you could also subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts to receive bonus episodes. For the cost of 2 cups of coffee per month, you could also become a Patreon member for early access to episodes, bonus episode videos, as well as an invitation to a private discussion group. You can find all the links in the show notes. Now, back to the show. Network Automation Nerds Podcast. Hello and welcome to Network Automation Nerds Podcast, a podcast about network automation, network engineering, Python, and a bunch of other technology topics that I find interesting. I'm your host, Eric Cho. Today is a distinct honor for me to welcome Dinesh Dutt to the show today. Before the show today, I figure I need to go read a bunch of RFCs and update my technical chops just so I could have a good conversation with Dinesh, because Dinesh is so accomplished. He is the author of one of my favorite data center networking books, Cloud Native Data Center Networking by O'Reilly Media. He also served as the chief scientist at Cumulus Networks, was a fellow at Cisco Systems, was the co-author of TRILL and VxLAN, and has filed over 40 patents. So in short, I hope I don't accidentally call BGP the Bridge Gap Protocol in this episode, really. And also, I just want to clarify, I am indeed trying to make Dinesh feel old by listing out all of his accomplishments. So I know I'm just going to enjoy this show. Welcome to the show, Dinesh.
Thank you, Eric. That was a very kind introduction. Thank you. And thank you for doing this show. I mean, it takes a fair amount of your time to get all this done, the record, the edit, and to make it available to a lot of people, plus your books. It's really nice. And I'm really glad to see people giving so much of their time and energy to helping the community. So thank you for doing this.
Well, thank you for the kind words. I think a lot of people mention, give me compliments on the show, and I appreciate it. But I think, to be honest, it's really, it's really I benefit the most. I find the excuse to reach out to people like you. I mean, I've reached out to you before, but it wasn't. It was just exchange pleasantries, right? But in this way, I'm able to just be for a small token of the time and maybe some investment in hosting, and I get to ask you all these awesome questions, and so that's really awesome. And I think this is actually one of my favorite time in the week, just to sit down and talk to people, and talk shops. So thank you for being on the show. Welcome.
Thank you for
Yeah,
having me.
yeah. So I mean, Dinesh, when I was preparing for the show, I was just like, how are you so awesome, and how can you accomplish so much stuff in such a short time? And I thought about just having this as a single question, and then you could spend like the next 40 minutes telling me, because that's how long it's going to take. But I think maybe it's a good idea to just start from the beginning and tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you get interested in technology? And in particular, how did you get into network engineering and network technologies?
Sure. The funny part of this is when I told my daughter that I was getting on this, she's a 14-year-old, so, teenager. I told her I was getting on this interview and that I would be asked this question. She said, like, once upon a time, my father was a little guy. He did not understand why he could not play like all the other boys with toys because he was a mechanical klutz. He got older in his life, realized he was still a mechanical klutz, and then he discovered programming, and life was wonderful again. So,
sounds like a fairy tale.
yeah. So this was her narrating it like that. So I thought it was very funny, and teenagers, how teenagers are. So I thought it was very funny that she narrated it that way. But it's actually very true. I basically was a mechanical klutz. I enjoyed reading. And then when I got presented a Casio PB100, growing up in India, these things are pretty hard. So when my dad, I don't know what made him get it, he got me a Casio PB100. It's like almost like a small calculator, a large size calculator with a one-line display.
Oh, okay.
And you would program BASIC in it. And I started playing with it and I got really excited. And that's all I could do. And then my dad got me what was then a ZX Spectrum. And I realized that, I wanted to do software. So I'm a self-taught programmer. I don't have a formal degree in computer science.
Oh, wow.
I have a
Really?
formal degree. So first, I call myself the illiterate in the family because I have only bachelors. My wife is a double MD.
Oh
so,
my God.
so I'm the illiterate. I have only bachelors, and it's in electronics. So, on pretty much everything I know in computers is self-taught. And how did I manage to do a lot? I think a lot of it has to do with luck. You got to put in a lot of effort on your side, obviously, but a lot of it has to do with luck. I
Hmm.
think when I joined Cisco, I knew always that I wanted to be in network, not network systems programming. And my
Yeah.
first love was my first love was AI. And
Okay.
when I looked at AI, there was nothing that could be done because AI was just a dead field. It was a backwater that nobody, and it wasn't possible unless you got into the academics to be able to do anything. Plus,
Right.
because it was self-taught, I did not have the math chops to be able to do a bunch of things.
Hmm.
So I basically said, like, okay, my next love was operating systems. But then getting into a company which does operating systems was pretty hard.
Oh, for sure.
And then what happened was I got into networking. I had dabbled in a bunch of things. So the first project I ever worked on was the database engine of a mainframe database system a long, long time ago. It was
Hmm.
a Bull mainframe. Bull is a French company,
Okay.
and their American partners were Honeywell. And they had a mainframe database system. And so I wrote the runtime engine of that database system a long, long time ago.
So
Uh,
how did you write that? I mean, there were so many interesting things when in just that you covered, right? First of all, it wasn't even like a full graphic calculator. It was like just
yes,
displaying one line,
one line.
one
Exactly,
line.
one line.
Yeah, because for me, the first, I guess, introduction was for the TI-85, the graphic calculator where you program snakes and all of that. But it wasn't even that. It was just
No,
like a one-liner
one
calculator,
line. That's
and
it.
then you self-taught on programming with a only with not only a bachelor's, right? Bachelors are great, and I only have bachelor's, but in electronics, but everything else was self-taught, and you were good enough to be able to hang with the best, right? So
Yeah,
that is super awesome, and also I think people may have missed that, but you were very humble about just giving a lot of credit to luck. And I think one of the books that I was reading is called The Psychology of Money,
hmm,
and it talked about the role of luck and risk
hmm,
in lives.
hmm.
And most people don't think about it because it's hard to predict luck and hard to predict risk. So all they could do is attribute, whatever accomplishment people have to, how hard they work, their morning routine, how they cut Starbucks. But you have enough self-aware to say, yes, I work hard, but I also am very lucky, to be born this age
Absolutely.
and join Cisco and be able
At
to
the
do
right
everything.
time, right? It also depends on different people join the company. I was not the only person who joined the Cisco at that time.
Yeah.
I got to be lucky. Now, clearly, I worked hard, but
Hmm.
hard work alone is not sufficient. I
Right.
think you do need people who support you, who encourage you, and who
Yeah.
recognize you for. So, my first project was on a spanning tree, and I
Mm.
joined the company, and they said, like, okay, so here is a project, and my manager handed me a piece of paper and said, like, this is a project, and we have a what's the word for it, a demo with a customer, which is
Yeah.
pretty impressive at that. If it's a $50 million deal or $150 million deal, if you
Right.
can get this demo done, and I don't expect you to, by the way, if you can get it done, in 3 months, that'll be great.
Okay.
uh, and I was like, okay. And I looked at it and it said spanning tree protocol. I didn't know what spanning tree protocol was. It said
Right.
VLANs. I didn't know what VLAN was. And there were no books at that time, right? Today, one
Right.
of the things people forget is how much information is available online.
Yes.
There was no information available online. You had to talk to people for this. And, I couldn't just go buy $50 books at that time to be able to do what I wanted.
Right.
And the funny part was, so then I met this person called Silvano Guy, who became my, the person I would call my mentor in some sense, because he was the person who, in some sense embodied nice guys don't finish last.
Oh, wow. Okay.
He is a really sweet guy, and I've encountered other people like that, but he was the first person I encountered who was like that. And he is very accomplished, but when you speak with him, he never shows off what he's accomplished in his life.
Right.
And it was, so we worked together, and because of all the work I did, I got on, that was my first patent, and it was to do this thing called uplink fast.
Mm.
And it was a pretty impressive demo. So what we did is, at the end of 3 months, we had MCI at that time show up, and they wanted to buy whether Cisco, or at that time I think it was Bay Networks. So they
Oh,
wanted to decide between the two, and they wanted to look at spanning tree. So
right.
what we did is, we did this uplink fast, where we broke the cable and we said, like, look, this is regular spanning tree that you get with everybody else.
Right.
Now watch the video, right? So there was a video showing, and then we broke the link, and
Hmm.
the video just stopped for a minute and a half while the spanning tree converged. Then we
Sure.
said, now with our fix, our patent, here it is. And it just blipped for a second and it continued.
Oh,
We won the
wow.
deal.
Okay. And
That was like,
you
so
didn't treat like
that,
the buffer time.
yes. So luck was the fact that I got the project at the time I did. Luck
Mm.
was the fact that I met someone like Silvano, who he and I worked together so closely, and we really hit it off.
Right.
Luck was my my manager thinking, like, Dinesh, you don't do anything, but I'll give you this really important project, right? Hard work was making sure it worked.
Yeah.
So, and getting it all done. So I think everything plays a role that way.
Sure.
And that was actually a big stepping stone, because a lot of people were impressed, and they came to me. Jay Shri, who is the CEO of Arista at that
Sure.
time, was in marketing at that time, so she came by. Kirti Melkote, who was the CEO of Aruba, came by my office, and they were all very impressed with, like, Dinesh, you've done so much, and you just came, and this is really cool, etc., etc. And one of the things everybody told me was, look, I think you'll go places, but you got to understand, you're a very excitable character. You have to be calm. You have to show the demeanor of a distinguished engineer or whatever. Otherwise, look at the distinguished engineers around you. I never got that demeanor. I never took those things. But I had a lot of people support me that way. And the other person who supported me a lot that way was a guy called Tom Edsel.
Mhm.
And to people outside Cisco, he may not be as well known, but he was a god within Cisco.
Mhm.
Because all the big chips, like all the big switches, like Catalyst 5000, Catalyst 6000, he was the main architect. And I was working with him. Later on, I became one of the key architects, but he was the main architect when I went.
Mhm.
And the reason he hooked on to me is, I sat in a room and I looked around. Every meeting I was in, when anything needed to be said or done, everybody turned to him. And he
Got
had
it.
to speak. So I said, like, okay, it's useful to learn from the people who are really good. And one thing I always followed as a maxim was, never tell your manager more than he or she needs to know.
How
So
so?
if
Please
something takes,
elaborate.
yes, if something takes a week, don't say a week. Because then what will the manager do? The moment your week is done, he or she will give you a task which they want done. I don't want to do just their task. I also want to learn. And I want to do
Right.
things that I find interesting, not what they find interesting. So I would always
Sure.
say 2 weeks, find the remaining week to go figure out who's doing interesting things in the company.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So luck was, I walked into the room of Tom Edsel one day and I said, Tom, is there anything interesting you're doing that you want help with? And
Yeah.
Tom had come to me by now, because know me by now because of all the work I had done. And Tom said, like, yeah, sure. We are designing the first hardware fib, it was a switching chip which had hardware in it. It was the first L3 switch, so to
Oh,
speak.
okay. Okay.
And he said, like, I'm going and designing that. Do you want to come help me with that? I
Yeah.
did not know what a fib was. I was like,
Well, hey,
sure,
I
no
still
problem.
don't.
So we walk into this room, and obviously my manager doesn't know, because the manager is like, your job is to work on X, not on Y.
Right. Right.
I don't
Perfect
care
that
what he
uplink
thinks.
fast.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I'm not interested in what he wants me to do. I'm interested in doing other things. So
Yeah.
Tom Edsel said, like, sure, come on. And we went in, we start chatting, and he's like, look, everybody here is an ASIC engineer. You're the only software engineer. Do you
Mhm.
want to come and explain to the team next week how the fib works and how MPLS works? Should we do MPLS?
Oh, wow.
I had never heard of MPLS. I didn't know what MPLS was. I was like,
Right.
sure, no problem.
And did you
So
and were you able to do that within a week? I mean,
yeah, yeah.
how did you do it though? Like, how do you ramp
I
up to
think
something
part
fast
of
from zero?
my skill, so back to hard work, first I work very hard.
Mhm.
And the second part of it is I think I'm a fast learner, so I was able to read things pretty quickly. The third,
Okay.
of course, is to realize, this old game in there's a book called If Tomorrow Comes by Sidney Sheldon. And in that book, there is a scene in which a late girl, the main protagonist who doesn't know chess at all, plays two grandmasters at the same time.
Mhm.
And the
Mhm.
way she does that is she has them in two different rooms. She goes there and starts the guy who does the first move. She goes and repeats the move to the other guy.
Right.
So the bottom line there is she was faking it. She didn't know. So part of my knowledge there was to understand also what I did not really know, what I was not good at,
Mhm.
and where my skill level fell down. So I spoke to a lot of people. And again, people in Cisco were very kind. They came, spent time chatting with me, explaining to me, someone like Fred Baker, who was like a big shot at that time. He was the head of the IETF. He was the IETF director. And he was a first Cisco fellow.
Mhm.
I went to him and said, Fred, how does this work? And
Yeah.
he sat down and he explained everything to me. So luck was me walking into Tom's room at exactly the minute that he was actually going to go work on the fib.
Mhm.
And hard work was figuring out all this stuff, going and making the presentation, going and finding people like Fred Baker, and people like Fred Baker supporting me, right? Just like Tom, just like Silvano, someone like Fred Baker. I was just a kid. He had no reason to talk to me. He didn't know who I was. But he took the time to explain it to me. He got other people in the room. So everybody took time to explain. And that gave me the leg up to latch pieces together.
I see. I see.
And that was made, that the chip was very successful. The chip was called Polaris, and it was very successful. It was a big seller for Cisco,
Right.
the enterprise for the Catalyst 6500.
Sure.
And that made Tom say, let's talk to Dinesh now.
Got it.
So that got me going. And so I became now Silvano and Tom, both of them. And meanwhile, my manager was pushing me to be a manager. And I said, like, I'm done. I don't want to. I was ready to quit Cisco because I didn't want to be a manager. And he
Oh,
said,
wow. You were willing to quit Cisco because if
yeah,
they make you a manager.
yeah. And I let them make me a manager. I worked as a manager for 6 months and I hated every day of it, except that I
I
got to
see.
work with some really beautiful people. I hired 4 people and they were just amazing people. I really liked that. And they're still friends with me. But other than that, I didn't like being a manager. So I was ready to quit. And Silvano said, I'm forming an architecture team. Do you want to be its first member?
Mhm.
And so that got me on. And so, things moved on. And then there was also Keith McClory, who people may not know was Mr. SNMP.
Okay.
He passed away, unfortunately, last year,
Okay.
or 2 years ago, actually. But, he was another person who was very nice in terms of helping me and kind of spending time talking to me. And kind of, the first time I came up with an idea that I was going to present to everybody, and it became a patent, which was a follow up to Uplink Fast. I was tremendously nervous because there were people in the room who really were bright and they attacked you they jumped up and they started talking in really loud voices and vigorous things. And I shouldn't say that because I have a loud voice myself. But, it was intimidating for a kid.
Yeah.
And I remember standing in the coffee break room and kind of drinking coffee and just being really nervous before the meeting. And Keith walked into the room and I said, like, hey, Keith said, so you're ready? And I said, like, I'm really nervous, Keith. He said, be
Yeah.
brave, Dinesh. Don't worry, you're good.
Mhm.
And that kind of gave me the feeling of like, yeah, I can do this.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
but
all of these different things of different people, hard work is involved, but also people like Tom, people like Silvano, people like Keith, all of them recognizing me and encouraging me was, I think, really important.
I think, yeah, that those are super important and rightfully give the credit to them, but also it's important to look at the trend, right? Like you were always prepared to take on more risk, to
Yeah,
take on more challenges,
yeah,
and you're always willing to work hard to
yeah,
explore,
yeah,
do the deliberate practice, right? So I
yeah,
think that's kind of a very crucial point that you mentioned is what you don't know. So then
Yeah.
you actively go out and seek for answers, and
Yeah.
so you're always working on that tangent, right? Like
Yeah.
your capability,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
you work on your tangent. So if you work, I don't know, how long did you work at Cisco?
15 years
15.
almost.
So
Yeah.
it wasn't like 1 year of experience repeated 15 times. It was
No.
it was
No.
definitely 15 years of experience that you always learning, and you know
Yeah.
leveraging all these resources within
Yeah.
Cisco and all
Yeah.
these awesome people. So that's
Yeah.
great. So
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
happened after the 15 years? How was it right after that you went to Cumulus, or
Yes. So what happened was essentially at that point, when I quit Cisco, I was a fellow. I had just become a fellow again because of
yeah.
Tom. They said we'll nominate Dinesh as a fellow, and they put up the nomination committee. And the committee said, like, look, we know Dinesh is a smart guy, but does he ever stand alone? He was always with you or with Silvano. Does he
Mhm.
ever stand alone? And I was pissed off because I had worked with Radia Perlman by that time.
Yeah,
She had liked
the
me, and
spanning
so
tree.
yeah,
Hello.
and I was like, I'd worked with a lot of industry luminaries, and I was very upset with the committee that they were, what's the word for it, telling this about me. The
Mhm.
other part that is interesting is I was working part time at that time.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, so I have been working part time pretty much from 2006, and that was the second time I went to quit. So I went
Okay.
to Tom's office and I said, Tom, I want to quit. Tom was my manager at that time.
Mhm. Okay.
And I said, I want to quit. And he said, what do you want to do? I said, I want to go work with a nonprofit. And he said, you know
Okay.
what? We can't let you go yet. Can you work part time and see if it works? And it worked out. My definition of part time is I probably left a lot of money at the table,
Yeah.
but it's my ability to control my time.
Right. Right.
And I wanted to kind of be, when we had a child, I wanted to be a father. I did not want to kind of not be there for her. So my take was like, if I can be there for her and say like, look, she wants me to come to her science program on Tuesday. My wife's a doctor. She takes care of all the back end. She can't do the front end. So 6 o'clock in the morning,
I like how
she's
you
gone at
describe it.
5:30, right?
Yeah.
She can
Yeah.
take care of the cooking, but at 5:30 she's gone in the morning.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it worked out well that way for us, that I was able to take this back seat. And again, the fact that I had chosen to be an engineer was the other part that was fun. A lot of people said you give up a lot of control, right? Again, back to this point of accomplishment or whatever. I don't know if I've accomplished a lot. I think, when I look at others, I feel like I've done nothing much. But
I
on
don't
the
know.
other
40
hand,
patents is pretty impressive.
but on the other hand, like I think one of the things I did, two other things I did is I said, look, if I want to be a VP or anything like that,
Yeah.
that's not going to happen with me being part time. That doesn't work.
Mhm.
So I said, I'm going to stay on the technical track because that's
Okay.
what I enjoyed the most. And so that's what I would go do.
Right.
The second part of it is I never chose or ran after titles.
Mhm.
I just said my goal was if tomorrow the manager says I have to lay off people, how do I make sure I'm one of the three people in the room that he says I cannot let this guy go?
Mm.
And my take was again not so much to running from a point of fear, but to be of so much value that nobody ever cared about anything else.
Right.
Right?
Nobody will move
That
your
was
cheese.
yes. I wanted to move the cheese before someone else did, so to speak.
Right. Right.
And
That reminds me
again,
of
luck plays a
yeah.
lot. Pardon?
No, no, I was gonna say, that reminded me of only the paranoid survives, right? Like you're always
Yeah,
on the edge. Maybe
yeah,
that's because of, I actually have the same mindset too, but maybe because that's I find it most prevalent in like immigrants and people
yeah.
who come from, kind of maybe
Who
scarcity in the
hunger?
childhood.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
who hunger for more? Yeah, I was just
Exactly.
agreeing with you. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, so so Andy Groves obviously was the ex-CEO for
hmm,
Intel, and he wrote the book of I don't know if there was that title, but essentially that's what I remember of it. Only the
a lot of
paranoid
people said
survives.
that. A lot of people. For me, it isn't about paranoia.
Yeah.
I have another friend of mine who said, Dinesh, we are awarded a lot in our life. We are rewarded a lot in our life for knowing the answers.
Okay.
The trouble with wanting to know the answers is that you invest a lot of energy in being right.
Okay.
that puts you at odds with a lot of people unless you're really phenomenally smart and you can always be right. But even then, if you can make your life about learning, you're always going to win. You're
Okay.
always going to come ahead. It doesn't matter what the outcome is because there was some learning involved. It's fun.
Hmm.
So I try to embody that of
Okay.
always thinking about learning as my reason for doing something.
Mm,
So, when I quit Cisco, again, back to just closing out the story,
of course.
Tom again was responsible because I was very upset. And I said, like, look, what the heck do they mean by, that I need to do this? And Tom said, look, Dinesh, I can go fight them. Or what I can do is simply put you ahead of me in everything that comes now. So every single call that people had to Tom, Tom would say, I have no time, talk to Dinesh. I have no time, talk to Dinesh. That put me for almost 6 months completely front and center in defining the data center strategy at Cisco.
Right. Right.
Now people saw what I could do and they said, okay, fine. And so when Tom went back to the fellow committee to say, I want to nominate Dinesh as fellow, it went through without a breeze. I mean,
I
it
see.
went through like with a breeze. There was no problem at all.
Wow.
And again, the point that I'm making is I had to work hard, but I had people like Tom, Silvano, who, especially those two, Silvano and Tom, who encouraged a lot for me and did a lot for me at Cisco.
Yeah. Yeah. But because I mean it goes both ways, right? Like you hang with it. So if he
Mhm.
said, yeah, go through Dinesh and it falls down after the first two calls, I'm sure Tom would step in and try to
Yes.
help you
Yes.
and
Yeah. Yeah.
see if you could remedy that. But you were able to hang and able
Yeah.
to be front and center with the data center
Yeah.
technology. And by the way,
And it's a big deal, right? To define the data center strategy at that
yeah,
time. For Tom to say, like, okay, you are sitting in the room with the CTO of the company, you're sitting in the room with a whole bunch of people from the company. So
yeah,
to kind of say, like, no, Dinesh will do that was some amount of giving up on his part. He
yeah,
was already an established figure, and you can say, like, what did he lose? But what I've seen in people is that many people, doesn't matter how much they have, they
yeah,
always feel like they want more. It was
mm,
Tom's bigness that he said, no, Dinesh, you go.
yeah,
Right. So again, I think I've managed to accomplish a lot because I stood on the shoulders of giants and I truly benefited from their uh, kindness to me. And I had to put in my hard work and do my thing. But
sure.
that was a lot of that.
Yeah, no, that's great. I
And then
really
when I
appreciate that.
quit Cisco, I went to INCMA. And I
Yeah.
went to INCMA because Tom wanted me to come to INCMA.
Okay.
But 2 weeks there, I said, this is a piece of junk. ACI is a piece of junk. I don't like ACI. I'm not going to
Okay.
do ACI and I want to
Okay.
quit.
Okay.
What I
And then
wanted to do was what Cumulus was doing, but I didn't know what Cumulus was doing at that
yeah.
time.
Yeah, it must have been pretty early stage when you joined, right?
Yes, there were 9 people already. But
Oh, wow,
JR
9
called me
people,
up.
whole 9 people.
Yeah. And JR called me up and said, Dinesh, can you come work
Yeah.
with me? I want to really take Cumulus somewhere. And as I thought about it, it was my choice was to be the last gasp of a dying empire or the first gasp of a new one. Or at least that's a story I spun to myself. And for me, and then I went to Tom. The hardest part of that exercise was leaving Tom. And Mario and Prem and Luca, who had seen me through Andiamo, were also very supportive of me through the time. And I did feel bad for leaving in CMA and kind of walking away from them. But the person I really felt bad was walking away from Tom. But
Mhm.
he said, Dinesh, as your friend, I cannot tell you must stay. I'm unhappy and I'm upset that you're leaving. But on the other hand, as your friend, I must support you and I will support you.
Yeah.
And so walking away after that was easier for me. And then, JR called me, and then JR, I was like, what will I do? And I was ready to quit technology again because I was like, look, build switches, done that. Written protocols, done that. So all of that is done. What do I have to do? So I was actually
What do
looking
you
for
learn, right? Like,
yeah,
as you mentioned, the whole
yeah,
thing for you was about learning.
exactly. And so I was like, okay, I was already a fellow at Cisco when I quit. Big deal, right? It wasn't the title I was chasing after anyway. So it was about learning. And I was like, okay. So I was sitting down and looking at I loved writing. I was to write a personal blog at that time.
Mhm.
And I was like, I'm just going to be a writer. I'm going to go
Okay.
do writing. And then JR called me out of the blue and said, Dinesh, I want you to come and work. I was like, I respected JR a lot, and I still respect him a lot. So he called me, and so I went and heard what he was doing. And I said, like, oh my God, this is the thing to do. And I was always an open source bigot. And so doing something in Linux was like, of course.
Right.
And so
Can
that
you tell us?
probably was very helpful to me again, in
Sure.
terms of, putting me front and center in a way that I was not at Cisco. At Cisco, people would call me when they had big guys show up and say like, hey, Dinesh, here is the JPMC, or here is Goldman Sachs, and they have a problem.
Yeah, they want to impress the customer, then they bring in
Exactly. And the customer has some big problem and they want to solve. Whereas at Cumulus, I have a network operator and the guy doesn't know what to do, right? I mean, he is trying to figure out how to do automation.
Right.
And how do you automate BGP? Have you looked at Ansible and automate BGP? It's impossible. So that's how sitting there gave me the ideas of seeing what a network operator dealt with firsthand.
So Dinesh, can you tell us what, for people who are not very familiar with Cumulus, can you tell us just a high overview of what Cumulus was trying to do, and just kind of a one sentence?
I think the simple way to think about it is what Cumulus wanted to do was what Linux and Intel did to Sun, HP, all of those guys, right?
Sure.
They were all gone. The only thing that was left standing was Linux and Intel. And our idea was, you don't want the hardware to determine what software you get.
Right. They
so
decoupled.
Think about the decoupling of the hardware and the software, exactly as happened in the server, but in the networking industry, and to kind of provide Linux as the operating system for networks.
Network gears, right?
Exactly. For routers, for bridges, for layer 2 switches, layer 3 switches, for all of them. And so we basically were working on this NOS, so to speak, which was basically Linux. And our secret sauce at that time was, we wrote a little engine, a driver that converted the Linux commands that you type, like IP route add or BGP, whatever, into whatever was required on the hardware. So we would interpret those messages and write to the hardware. So that was the thing. And so I got to see firsthand what a lot of people were doing. And that gave me the insight to do things like BGP unnumbered and FRR, all the stuff that we did in FRR, and the simplifications of EVPN. So that, when you looked at automating configuration, it was really trivial. It became very, very easy for you to automate. So that's what I did. And JR there was very helpful. He was very supportive of, like, the way it would work is JR would be the CEO. He would walk in, do a bunch of things. And when it came to technical stuff, they would turn to me and say like, okay, Dinesh, you go deal with it. So, and that started with presenting the high level pitch to the lowest level, whatever else. And that's where I first encountered Ivan Pepelniak. He had come for a networking field day. And funnily enough, he was very impressed with BGP unnumbered and everything else. And he and I started chatting, and now we are good friends. And, I have presented a lot of stuff, and people know a lot about me also because I've presented a lot of things with Ivan Pepelniak. So there have been, like, again, pointing out that you have to do the work, but also all the right people at the right time in terms of being just kind, helpful, etc. Made a big difference in my life in terms of being able to accomplish, for whatever measure you call it, an accomplishment, what I have accomplished.
I mean, Ivan is a hard person to impress. I mean, he knows for his straight shooting, no BS.
Exactly.
He's got this, these gray hair to back him up and say, this is just BS, right? Like, he calls the BS out when he's So it's funny you said he was very impressed. I'm like, oh my God, you're like one of the handful of people that could say that, right? Like, usually it's, okay, you don't suck, and that was a compliment.
But no, it was a lot of fun. In fact, JR and a whole bunch of others didn't even believe that. They were like, no, Ivan is such a grumpy guy. He will never, he must have liked one little thing. And I was like, no, I think Ivan likes what I'm talking about, and I'm not BSing. And
are we talking about
Ivan always like? No, even today he and I were exchanging an email, and so we are good friends now. So it's kind of nice. Again, like I said, I've tried my best to always be honest and be of service to whoever it is that I'm talking to. So when I'm talking to you, I'm trying to be of service to you and the audience and whoever it is that who hears this podcast, so they get a couple of things out of it in some way. And hopefully what they hear is that I worked hard, but I was also very lucky, and I had the good fortune of meeting a whole bunch of really good people which made my life different and what it is now, as opposed
Yeah.
to saying like, oh, I'm some cool dude who accomplished all these wonderful things.
No, I mean, the thing that I think of is luck is for the people who are prepared.
Exactly,
So
fortune favors the prepared. Yeah,
yeah, fortune
exactly.
favors you
Yep,
put it much more elegantly.
it's a quote. I didn't put it. I
Yeah,
read it
of
somewhere
course. No,
else,
you brought up
like
the good
everything
quote,
else.
right? Okay, so now you know and I remember reading about your LinkedIn post on your retirement on from Cumulus, right? And you
Yeah,
you actually had balloons. They had a big
yeah, yeah,
cake with your
yeah,
book on the cake. So what prompted you for your next project, right? Like, and um, I am going to ask you this very difficult question on, first of all, what's after that for Cumulus, and also I want to ask you, how do you pronounce that project? SuzieQ, right? So, and I kind
So
of gave it away, but I want to hear your side.
yeah. So the way you pronounce it is SuzieQ. I always write the Q small. I've been thinking of making it now capital, and I've started using capital because I heard from a bunch of people saying like, "We don't know how to pronounce this damn thing. Is it Suzie? Is
Yeah,
it?"
Suzik.
Yeah,
That-
they came up with all kinds of, and I was like, "Guys, where is your rock and roll history? It's SuzieQ. It's a CCR song."
Oh, okay,
So
yeah. So
yeah.
I'm sorry. I was one of those fools who pronounces Suzik. In fact, I was talking to Ray Donato, and
Uh-huh.
we were talking about different testing tools and frameworks and observability, and I actually call it Suzik. And so thank you for setting me straight here.
No, not at all, not at all. I mean, my mistake, right? I put a small Q. How is someone supposed to know? I am like a lot of pop cultural history is kind of flows through me when I speak because remember those things. It's like the Elton John song, sad songs because they say so much because they hurt so good to. It feels so good to hurt so bad because someone else knows how to make you really feel the hurt that you have going on. So similarly, if someone has a very good quote, I'm very happy to take their quote and use it rather than pretend like they're all mine. Life is so rich and there's so many people have done so many things. I don't see any reason to keep on duplicating other people's work. So yeah, so it's called SuzieQ, and I call it.
Okay.
It's called SuzieQ because I was listening to the CCR song when I was thinking of this. This is a problem that's bothered me a lot especially when I was at Cumulus, and I saw it that people who try to work on some things, the network operators, they always had difficulty that they had to figure out. Even when something went wrong, they would type trace route. That would give them the locus of where to start from. Then they would log into the box, do show running config, do this, do that. And it was all a very manual step-by-step process that I thought was actually pretty ridiculous.
Hmm.
And I said, like, we have the tools to think about this. So again, coming back to Cumulus, one of the
Right.
things I learned from Cumulus, my takeaways from Cumulus is networking people tend to think of themselves as embedded systems people, meaning they sometimes don't take advantage of the tools that are available to them that regular software application developers take advantage of,
Right. Right.
or
Absolutely.
software even system software people take advantage of. Whereas at Cumulus, because we thought of ourselves as Linux people, we
Mm-hmm.
just took advantage of everything. For us, we didn't care. So
Right.
using Redis was not a big deal for us,
Right. Right.
or picking up something else and using it was not a big deal for us. It was pretty straightforward. Using a file system to be a checkpoint in terms of commit and rollback was not a big deal for us because we thought of ourselves as Linux people taking advantage of all the ecosystem that is available to a system developer, as opposed to thinking my only availability is my appliance. I
Right.
build an appliance and I can only do so much. The only other people I've seen come close to that are Arista, and before that Cisco.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, not Cisco, Juniper.
Right.
Otherwise, everybody else, Cisco, even to this day, really screws up how they present their operating system, right? It's still a very, very dumbed down version. And if I feel like there is one thing I wish people could do more is for them to kind of really open up and see that, to think of themselves not as, an appliance vendor, but as a general purpose operating system vendor. And your specific thing in this case is networking,
Right.
but you can avail of all of the tools that are available to any software Linux developer,
Yeah,
so to
back to
speak.
that decoupling, right? Like you're
Yep.
decoupling the hardware. And so,
Yep.
yeah, so of course, Cisco is, could be like Apple, right? Apple still does the software and hardware, but both of them are best in class. And
Yes.
the software people don't necessarily talk to the hardware people, but at the same time, they take advantage of each other's particular domain. And in this case, the Wintel model where the software is able to take advantage of what back to what you were talking about, because Juniper is based on BSD, so they could
Yep.
take advantage of all these tools, and Arista was Linux, and they're able to take advantage of those tools as well. So now you discover, I mean, not discover, but now you have this mindset. Uh, after Cumulus, you started a project, right?
Yep. So when I was at Cumulus, like I said, I realized that we have a lot at our disposal to understand and play with. I am not limited to the tools that network developers necessarily are stuck with. Network,
Right.
either software vendors or operators are stuck with. That enabled me to start thinking differently about the whole thing. And one of the things I saw was, especially at that time, there was a lot of churn in terms of every day there was a new database coming out, right? A new time series database coming out.
Right. SQL, no SQL, big data.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And so there was all of that flux going on.
Yeah.
And then the
All named
trouble
after
was,
animals.
yes. And the trouble was that everybody thought about it from the perspective of whatever my data store is, that data store will provide everything. So, for example, if you decide that you're going to change your data store, all the data that was in the data store, to export it and write it somewhere else is real pain.
Yeah.
Right? So people shift entire NMSs simply because their data store went obsolete. Right? There were
Mm.
RRDs, then there was Cactus,
Yes.
there was Cacti, and then there was Graphite, and then there was InfluxDB, which was better than Graphite, and then there was Prometheus, and all of these guys were. And one of the things that struck me is, why do I have to be limited to whatever it is that anybody does?
Okay.
I'm looking at it as saying, like, I want the best in breed and I don't want to be tied to anybody.
Okay.
So tomorrow there is a new tool. I want to be able to switch to it as quickly as possible, because again, I see myself not as the best in the business about anything. What I can do, however, is hopefully stitch things together. And as they say, try and think about what is not worth wasting your effort on.
Okay.
One of the things that I learned, I would say, if if you had to pick one thing, Dinesh, that causes your gray hair, that you can say explains the reason why anybody should appreciate your gray hair, I would say that it is the things that you learn what not to do. What are problems that are not worth solving?
Okay.
Right? There is this line that I quote a lot. Anybody who's heard me knows that I use this all the time. Is Dizzy Gillespie, the famous jazz saxophone player, not jazz saxophone, trumpet player. I think it's trumpet. I don't know, trumpet or saxophone now. I don't want to pretend I know the answer correctly. So anyway, he said, it took me all my life to know what not to play.
Oh, okay.
So I thought of that a lot. To me, it is what problems are not worth solving.
Okay.
Because when you attempt to solve something to the 99th or the 100th percent, it adds a whole bunch of inefficiencies, because that last tail really throws it out of the whack. And
Right.
then what you end up having is a really complex system that 99% of the people don't care about, but now have to deal with because you wanted a 100% solution.
Right.
Many times, simply framing the problem. In AI, there is this thing called the framing thing, which is, how do you know when you define something, what is inside the definition and what's outside the definition? That framing is really important. And so to always be able to say, this is what I will not bother doing. This is a
Yeah.
problem I will not attempt to solve. So
Yeah.
my thought process in that was, again, to come back to this whole thing is, I don't want to be stuck with a tool that is stuck with whatever is the technology that happened to be ripe at that time. I
Okay.
want to be able to evolve, and I want it to be open source, and I do not want to be tied to anybody.
Okay.
So Prometheus, for example, is a wonderful metrics database, but it doesn't store anything but numbers. And I did not
Hmm.
want to store numbers. There are enough people storing numbers. I wanted to start with a problem of a whole bunch of other things that people are interested in and that network operators wouldn't know. So A cannot talk to B. All problems in the world are roughly that network operators face are of one of two kinds. A cannot talk to B, or A can talk to B, but very suboptimally. And you got to
Hmm.
figure out what's going on. In those
Right.
two cases, it's not always the metrics that matter. It is to know, first of all, where is A? Which
Right.
router is it on? What switch is it on?
Yeah.
What layer 2 box is it on? I mean, just to know where it is. Or sometimes people want to understand, where are the WRFs? Where is a particular WRF? What are all the devices on which a particular WRF is? Or what do I need to do in order to upgrade my data operating my data center? Do I need 10 switches because now the new switches are 64 port and my old switches were 32 port? Do I
Right.
need half of them, or do I need only a third because I'm not really using all my ports? There are
Right.
so many questions which are not related to anything to do with troubleshooting, nothing to do with, it's just knowing what is there, having data and being able to query it and access it and use it in meaningful ways. So
Hmm.
my thought process was that's where I wanted to go. And so after scratching my head a lot, I loved this columnar file format called Parquet.
Yeah. Right.
And I thought it was really spot on. And I saw that a lot of people were using it,
Right.
especially in machine learning and AI applications. The big data application people were using it. And my thought process was, if you are going to gather a whole ton of data, then that whole ton of data is obviously going to be require some amount of querying. Otherwise, you can't search. I mean, today, if you look at the internet, at some level, if Google or DuckDuckGo or your favorite tool can't find it, that information as well might not exist. It's like the classic argument: if there is no one to hear when a tree falls in a forest, did the tree really fall? Right?
Right, right. And just
Or
to clarify, the Parquet is spelled Praquet.
correct.
And how is that different than like the relational database? How does it help you from abstracting from just, database centered tool to, answering questions that you posed?
So, first of all, it was not a database, it was a file format, and that
So,
meant that I could start much more easily. Today, there are column oriented databases. For
yeah,
example, there is ClickHouse, which is a column oriented database. There is Druid, which is a column oriented database. And I believe Druid is a Apache project. So there are things, but when I looked at it, they weren't there, or at least I didn't find them. And the
yeah,
basic idea is, if you think about how a relational database works, first of all, you have to define the relations. And I did not
right,
want to define relations. That's the thing I took out of Redis, which was, I don't want to define relations. I would like some things, but I don't want to define them.
right.
The second thing I wanted to
Not
do,
define them in the database or not
exactly,
define in the
exactly,
storage anyways. Yeah.
exactly. So the second part I wanted to do was to say that if you look at relational database today, or any traditional row oriented database, when you have a thing like, for example, Eric's name, Eric's first name, Eric's last name, his address, his title, and the company he works for, just take those five.
Yeah.
Typically all five are stored in a row, and you store row after row after row after row,
Right, right, right.
right?
Right.
But Eric is a common enough name that there will be at least one more Eric in the company.
Right.
So columnar storage says, store the first name as a column as itself. So you
Mhm.
store columns, not rows, and you construct the rows.
Okay.
So what that means is that when you are looking for only certain pieces of information, for example, I just want to find software engineers, how many of
Mhm.
them are there? It's very
Mhm.
easy if you just look up the column, which is software engineer. And again, think about the compression. There are hundreds of software engineers. If I do row based compression of that information, it's much harder, right? Because there are lots of bits which are different. There is Eric, which is different. The next name is Chow. Someone else might be Eric Andrews. Someone
Yeah.
else might be Eric, Sowell. And they're all different people. And you have to store all of that information. And they may all be software engineers. Whereas if you compress software engineers, that's one bit. So I just need
Mm.
one bit to store all the rows of software engineers, just one bit. So it's
Right.
phenomenal compression. Also, it's very efficient in querying, and that's the way the Parquet system is built and the tools around it. That I really like the elegance of it and the simplicity of it.
Mhm.
Because building a tool like SuzieQ, one of the things I was very careful of, or I'm very concerned about, when I say concerned, is top of mind in terms of design,
Yeah.
One of the things for that is who's watching the watcher. If
Okay.
SuzieQ becomes really good, then the world that SuzieQ shows is the world you see. If it lies to you deliberately or otherwise, then you have a problem, because now you don't know. You are led astray. So I was
Right.
very clear that I did not want to do that. And I'm also
Yeah.
a phenomenally lazy person. I don't want to fix bugs if I can help it. I don't want to write code if I can help it. If someone's already done the work for me, I'll take theirs very happily. I have zero interest in repeating work.
Right.
And if someone has done a good enough job, I will start there and I will add the stitches that need to be done in order to make it do what I want, so to speak.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
my point to you is that, so that's why I chose Parquet as a database backend,
Yeah.
because then I'm no longer stuck with a single tool. I can use many different tools. There are lots of people who use lots of different tools to work with Parquet. Amazon works with Parquet.
Hmm.
Google works with Parquet. So I
Right.
can go to the cloud. I can stay with this. I can start with a new tool tomorrow. I can add a SQL front end. I can do whatever I want simply because my backend is independent of my front end. Same thing with the Polar. Today I've written a Polar, and the Polar does a bunch of functions like normalizing the data, gathering the data, and I use SSH to pull most of the data or REST.
Yeah.
And I had this tweet out 2 days ago, which got like a whole ton of impressions. And it was all about the fact that I said, it's 2022 people. There's an operating system which is fairly new, and it does not give me all the routes of all of the wharfs. And this was multicast routes. And I was like, this is ridiculous.
Yeah, I think that the quote was about how was it the VRF that you're not showing the
Yes,
routes for VRF?
yes.
You have
You're not showing
specifically,
it for all the VRFs.
yeah,
And my
yeah,
problem is that, and everybody jumped in and you had a bunch of people who were trying to be kind and help me explain how it could work. And I was not so interested. I knew how to make it work. My point was,
yeah.
it doesn't have to be so hard,
Right,
right?
right.
It's all software at the end of the day. So it
Yeah,
doesn't mean you can't do something. It's just hard. It's more complex. It's more steps. That means the number of people who can do it is much lower.
right.
And what I realize is that there are a whole ton of problems associated with, and people were saying like, oh, you should use GNMI. Sure, I'll use GNMI. Does it give me all the data I want? And I spent some time looking at it. It doesn't. There's
Hmm.
tons of data I want that GNMI doesn't give me.
Yeah,
There is also GNMI works with the modern version of the software. There are tons of people with old versions of software. So one of the things I'm doing to SuzieQ right now is adding support for Nexus OS version 7.
okay.
So the number of devices that are with Nexus OS version 7 versus Nexus OS 9 is like it's an order or two magnitude difference.
Yeah. Well,
So
Dinesh,
now what am I spending time on? I'm spending time on telling everybody, if you're in this new world, life is beautiful for you. If you happen to be the old world, for whatever your reason is, you're screwed. I don't like that. Network
yeah,
operators, this is the part of the problem. Network operators deal with that reality all the time. So telling them, go to this reality is a problem.
right, right. So Dinesh, I mean, so you have a Parquet, which is a very flexible backend, allows you and you decouple from the front end.
Mhm.
And so if you can just tell us what SuzieQ is in you call it observability, right? So how is that observability different than monitoring, different than SNMP, as you mentioned? So what does it do for the network operator after you discover this problem set, and then you match that with the technology backend? And SuzieQ is obviously the thing that links the two. So what does it do, and how does it help the network operators?
So the first thing that I realized very quickly when I sat down is network operators again, or network tools again, are structured very much around what a network vendor is willing to give to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if the network vendor doesn't want to give you something, you can't get it.
Right.
That's okay. That's true of many systems. It's not true of network. But in this particular case, we not only take that, but on top of that, we add another constraint, which is it has to be given in a format that I understand, which is SNMP. And
Hmm.
people have chased this myth of a uniform data model forever. I mean, who has a working SNMP MIB outside of interfaces, right? Everybody has got their own version of SNMP for
Yeah,
BGP, for
right.
this, or if they have one for BGP now, it is the 10th iteration after a million other iterations.
And it's a very basic set, right? Like there's
Exactly.
no, it's all
Exactly.
enterprise
Yes.
names. Yeah.
Yes. You and I are obviously making a bunch of people very unhappy right now who are furiously scribbling the BGP implementation down. This version of Cisco is actually excellent and I use it. Sure, more power to you. I have zero fight with you. My
Yeah, yeah,
problem is not that. It's what
yeah,
about the people who are running all the other versions and people who had to migrate from one version of SNMP to the other, as everybody went from the proprietary version that a vendor sold to the non-proprietary version. And tomorrow the
exactly.
vendor will add a new version, a new feature, which won't be supported by the standard. And now what do I do?
Yeah, feverishly compiling those MIBs
Yeah, exactly.
into
And no,
the
in fact,
NMS.
many
Yeah,
times people don't even write the MIPS for them. They always come
yeah, right.
later, which is worse. So my
Yeah,
thought process was, I don't want to have to fight with anybody. You give
mhm,
me structured data, I will take structured data. You give me
right.
unstructured data, I want to take unstructured data. I don't care. My
Okay.
bottom line is two things. I do not want a network vendor to tell me what the data model is, because getting two different network vendors to agree on a data model is impossible.
Hmm.
And so I don't want to have a network vendor define a data model for me. I'll figure it out. For
Yeah,
heaven's sake, they can't agree on what the uptime format is. Forget anything else. And they
yeah.
each pick an uptime format, which is not standard anymore. You don't even find Python libraries to parse them anymore. They are that obsolete.
Oh my
So
God, that is
yeah,
like that would give me nightmares.
yeah,
When you
that's one
just
of the
said,
things. If you look at SuzieQ code, one of the things is convert Cisco time format into standard, convert Juniper time format into standard. They're all
yeah,
different.
yeah,
And so my point again is at least agree on something, right? Or uptime. One shows uptime in milliseconds, another shows uptime in seconds, another shows uptime in seconds till it hits minutes, then it only shows in minutes. I mean, everybody is different.
yeah,
And even they can't agree on any of those things. Some of them say, we give you structured data. You attempt to use the structured data, it's not even valid JSON.
yeah,
So my take is like, I don't want to argue and debate over if GNMI is the way to go. I'll happily switch to GNMI. I don't want to have a debate over whether GNMI is the right version or the wrong version. Is the wrong
right.
thing.
No religion.
I have no religion. I want
Yeah,
the data. That's all I
yeah.
care about. How I get it, I don't care.
So I think so. I'm just gonna obviously we're gonna include this in the show notes, but I'm gonna read what you have on the SuzieQ introduction. Read the docs. So
Mm-hmm,
it says on the very introduction page, it says
mm-hmm,
SuzieQ does multiple things. We gather data,
mm-hmm,
right, and using a polar and whatever data format that people would give you, like you mentioned,
mm-hmm,
and then you normalize the data into a
mm-hmm,
vendor agnostic format,
mm-hmm,
store it in Parquet,
mm-hmm,
and then you expose those analytics
mm-hmm.
via any way you could. So that's the
Yep,
CLI, the GUI, the REST API, and
yep,
Python
yep,
SDKs. And
yep.
then the output will render into different format that is applicable to you, plain text, JSON, CSV. And then you can,
Markdown, anything you want. Yep.
right. Um, and then the analytics engine would it's based on pandas. So you again back to what you were talking about, leveraging the best of class tools existing that's out there, which in pandas data frames is kind of the standard for data science people
For a whole
to
bunch of things.
yeah,
Exactly. But also, I don't need pandas. In
sure,
the enterprise version of SuzieQ, for example, we replaced it with something else.
yeah,
Simply a more powerful version of pandas. Why? Because I can. I don't need to rely on pandas. Again, this fact that I use pandas today, 99% of the code is in pandas.
hmm,
But I can switch to whatever else that they have tomorrow without a problem. So I have written a Spark backend, for example,
hmm,
using Apache Spark. I have written another different backend. So I can use different backends for each case if I need to. So tomorrow, if I'm working with a network which has got 10,000 devices, I just change the backend and I get what I want. I don't need to change the Polar. I don't need to change Parquet because Parquet is already geared towards high big data. So
yeah,
that's not what I need to tackle. I need to tackle the engine that can read this very quickly. Whether I switch to Dask, whether I switch to Spark, whether I switch to whatever else, I don't want to be tied again to something that has nothing to do with the data format, that has nothing to do with how I gather the data,
yeah,
right? So
right,
every time I'm changing the whole equation, it becomes very problematic for anybody. And also, the other thing that I'm very focused on is giving tools that network operators can use, whether they are CLI jockeys or they are DevOps CI/CD pipeline jockeys.
sure, sure.
Whatever is the end you are in, I want to be able to help you build and take advantage of the tool.
Yeah, so I think those are the very important design principle that you just mentioned, right? Because
Yeah.
you want to be able to switch out these components, and
Mm-hmm.
therefore, again, at the same time, you want to be vendor agnostic. And
Mm-hmm.
going back to, I don't know, CAS 6500 days, right? Like,
Yeah,
so all of these, like the new and the old. So therefore, you're actually using an agentless model for your Polar to
exactly.
grab these data, and you're
Yep.
not really relying on the vendor give you a API or for normalized data output. You normalize them yourself. So I think what you just mentioned were kind of the whys behind
Yep.
the things that you chose to do
Hmm.
for SuzieQ.
Yep, exactly. And my take in again in all of this, like I said, is to be able to not just two things I don't want to do is provide them with a dashboard or with something that is predefined by somebody, in this case a vendor. And in order for you to do anything, you have to go back to the vendor. First of all, there is a line that I think one of the people said, which is, you can't debug with a dashboard. The dashboard tells you what is wrong, but then you need to be able to go do more than that. And I
Yeah.
want to again make it available for people to know that they can ask these questions that people couldn't ask before.
Well, can you give us an example? So obviously, I'm very impressed with the tool, but
Thank you.
and now I'll tell you after you answer that question. I'll tell you what my favorite feature of SuzieQ was. But yeah, can you give us a question?
Sure.
Can you
So
give us
let's
an
start with
example?
a very trivial one, right? The
Sure.
most basic, really boring one.
Yeah. Version.
What is the status of BGP across all my devices?
Okay. Sure. That
It's
works.
that trivial. Or OSPF,
Yeah.
right? That is so trivial, there's nothing. Or to start with your example, device version. What
Sure.
versions of software do I have,
Hmm.
right? So first is to, the other thing that SuzieQ does, and I have tried to do this every time, is think of the tool as Google Earth, right?
Okay.
You
Okay.
can zoom in and zoom out, but you can
Nice.
zoom in and zoom out not both in space and in time.
Yes. Yes.
So you can go back in time because everything is stored with a timestamp. You can go back in time, or you can go very deep and say, show me what happened to this one field. I want to only look at this one field across time and across different devices.
Yes.
And I
Yes.
want to be able to help you do that. Or I want you to be able to step back and say, how many verfs do I have and how many routes do I have per verf? I want you
Right.
to be able to get that info as well. So you're all the time looking in terms of not a box, but a system. The
Right.
network is a system. It's a distributed system. It's probably the original distributed system in a way, right? It with the protocols and with everything else, it's trying to give you this idea that it is one unified thing. And this
Right.
whole SDN crap, which basically went off and tried to create a centralized entity, is not the right way to think about it. The illusion of each one being independent is good, and that they work together in unison, because that's what makes the network infallible, because it's not whether one device fails, the whole thing cannot fail.
Right. Right. Which is the very origin of the defense system that they put out
Exactly.
there. Yeah. The what is
Exactly.
it? DARPA net? Yeah.
Yep. DARPA. Yep.
Yeah. So
So that is the thing. I mean, SDN has its uses in certain situations. I'm not trying to rain on their parade, but in the particular cases that I have, that I
yeah.
see most people needing networks for,
Yeah.
that's not really a good use of time and
Right.
energy. So letting the routing protocols, and you don't have to be a fan of BGP, to heck with BGP, use OSPF if that's what makes you happy, pick something else if that's what makes you happy. But the point is that it's distributed. There is no single point of failure, that the blast radius when anything fails is proportional to the thing that is failing, and it's always as small and contained as possible. All of those things start there. And my point is that, coming back to your question, what can we do? You want to be able to ask these questions in a simple way. So device version, what operating system? The next thing you want to be able to do is show me only those BGP sessions that failed. You can say
Right.
that's a filter, but find that filter today with many of the things, right? What you'll have to do is you have to put a pipe. And the way most people show BGP summary is they either put a state or they put the count of the number of prefixes exchanged in the same column. So now think about how you're going to do the include or not, because you will have to say everything that is what, because when it is established, it's not established you're looking for a number. If it's a number, it's established. And because
Right.
the BGP protocol state keeps changing, idle, active, connect, you can't just look for idle, you can't just look for active. So even a simple thing, that's an example to me of how a simple thing can be very hard. So when
Right.
I was writing the book, I saw this thing, and I added a command to FRR, which is show BGP summary failed. Now that's
Mhm.
only just one device, but now you can see it across multiple devices. Now you can go on another step and say, not only it failed, tell me why it failed. Is it because the peer was set up with the wrong configuration? Is it that the peer was not even configured? Or even if it is configured and everything is working, maybe there is a problem, which is that you're not advertising all affy-saffys. So one of the users ran into this problem that they were not actually, they had forgotten to configure an affy-saffy at the edge. So they had no IPv6 configured at the edge on one side. So they're only exchanging IPv4 routes, and their IPv6 routes were getting killed. And they were trying to figure out why. And because it was two different vendors, the two vendors were arguing. Instead, with SuzieQ, they just turned it on and they said, like, sorry, BGP assert says not all affy-saffys are exchanged.
Nice.
And so they were able to catch it right away. So, you asked what questions. So this is the increasing level of sophistication.
Right.
And someone else said, and you can't do this today with SuzieQ from the CLI. You'll need to write some Python for it. But I hope to enable that later on, is to say, take all the leaves in your network.
Yeah.
Take the time the interface came up. Take the time when the OSPF or the BGP session came up on that interface.
Yeah.
Subtract the two. That will tell you and compute the average. Now that tells you across the leaves what's the average uptime of OSPF. Now compare the average uptime of OSPF with Juniper versus Cisco versus Arista. Now you can start talking about things differently. Right? Or you go to a vendor and you tell the vendor, like, look, your new version of software is actually much slower than before. Or they tell you, we've got this wonderful new feature. Okay.
Yeah.
When you turn it on, you can't even answer whether it's right or wrong. Today, half of network design is hard. You just listen to the vendor because there's no way for you to evaluate anything automatically.
Yeah.
And so I want SuzieQ to be able to help you with all of this in a way that you can't do today.
Right. I mean, it also solves a hard problem, right? Like, what if you have some sort of race condition within your network, not just within a box, but race condition. I mean, we've actually had these problems where you turn on everything at the same time and everything just crashing together. And then you would loop through these states on establishments.
Exactly.
And they never get to a state or fully established because everybody's always trying to establish and coming up. Now you go into this place of staggered turning up. You turn up the first one, then the second one. But with SuzieQ, you can actually ask the question and you can actually see pretty well that what happened there over time. So that's actually my favorite feature of SuzieQ was you could tie time into it. It's not just a snapshot of whatever monitoring that you have, but it's snapshot plus time. So you could actually go back in time, your time machine, and say, when you include that dimension, there's a lot of problem that you could address and you could solve and so on.
And that's one of the things that I'm trying to do, is then be able to look at logs, look at metrics, and then to be able to correlate them in ways that you can't do today. And I can tell you, I guess somebody, I didn't do any marketing around this or anything like that, but today I just learned that Stardust has been, so Stardust is the company behind SuzieQ. When I wrote SuzieQ, it was very much an open source project. I did not have anything, but people started calling me and saying, like, hey, if you want us to use this in our enterprise, you need to have a company behind it, give us a support, give us all of these various things. So I decided to start a company. I had no company in mind when I started the whole thing, but we started this whole enterprise. So today I learned that Gartner has chosen as a cool networking vendor. Networking vendor. Yes.
Yeah.
This is my first public announcement of that news.
Yeah. You're the only one
on your podcast.
Not publicly like blasting through social. You're the first person who Gartner names, and you're just like, whatever.
No, I haven't said that. I will go, and I'm really excited. I will go. Okay. It's a good thing they have done, especially for someone like me who kind of hasn't spent any marketing dollars or done anything else.
Zero.
And it's like, through open source. And again, back to your question of, accomplishment or whatever, I look at it as I put in the work to try and build something of value. Others who saw that of value started speaking about it, and that led them to potentially look at it and I guess consider us as a cool networking vendor.
Yeah, no, congratulations. It's a big achievement, especially for something that is so young and new. All the other cool vendors that I know have at least existed for two or more years.
Now, to be fair, Stardust has been around. I've been writing code now for 2 years, but it's not really as a company, right? I mean, now
Yeah.
is when I've really formed the company. Last September is when I really formed the company, so to speak,
Hmm.
and started when I had my friend Neela Jacques join me and kind of help me set it up because I couldn't create a business on my own.
Hmm.
I'm technical guy, remember? So he had time, so he said like, Dinesh, I'll come help you set up the whole thing. So Neela
Yeah.
Jacques, he's a good friend of mine, and he helped me set up and get the thing going, so to speak. And so anyway, so back to, I think these are important problems to solve, and getting the award of cool vendor only makes me feel like I really need to now step up to that responsibility and that honor of really being that cool vendor, not just something that somebody said and therefore I want to be rest on my laurels, so to speak.
Yeah. So how big is SuzieQ in terms of like stars on GitHub or the amount of? I mean, from what I look, it really kind of blown up last year. It's just
Yeah,
like getting a lot of tractions as far
yeah,
as the
yeah, yeah,
SuzieQ
yeah.
project, but also Stardust System, right?
Yeah, it's getting a lot of traction. We are, I mean, from in terms of just numbers, we have 505 GitHub stars as of today,
Oh wow,
and
that's nice.
that's pretty nice again to see that pretty much a large portion of it till recently was written just by me,
Yeah,
and to see that it has gotten the traction it has, and it's all good. It tells me that there is a real problem here that people want to address, want to solve,
yeah.
and so I'm focused on again being of service and of value more than anything else. And in the process, if I can make some money, that would be nice. It's like that song, give world, God please give, solve world hunger, God give peace a chance, God stop warring nations, and if you have a time, give me someone to love. It's like that.
By the way, if you don't
Yes,
mind.
find someone to give me someone to love. So it's like that. I want to be of service. I want to be able to do all these things, and if I can make some money, that's good.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. There's nothing wrong with that, right? It's got
Yeah.
to be a sustainable model,
Yes.
and you pay back to the community, and you
Yes.
attribute that, and you
Yeah.
reinvest into the community.
Yes.
So, Dinesh, I mean, I think I know you have a hard stop, and I appreciate all of the time that you've given. But before we go, I'd like to ask you, how can people help and contribute to the SuzieQ project? Because it's really important that we do. If you like the project, like I do.
Thank you. Thank you for asking that question. That's a very useful one. I think the most important thing you can do is actually engage with it, meaning
Yeah,
download it, use it,
yeah,
and more importantly, like everything else, if it doesn't do what you expect it to do, engage with the community. Help us make it better.
yeah,
Or if you think that this is something that you want that's in the enterprise, pay for it, support us in various ways so somebody can write code. So for example, there is a guy, Ryan Morol. He basically wrote a reverse proxy to enable people to be able to use a single mechanism to be able to have both a single common URL to talk to the docs, to talk to the GUI, so that the GUI is not really HTTPS based, so you can do things in HTTP. So that's a simple thing you can say, but that was his contribution. There are a whole bunch of people who reach out and give me data to parse out their problems. So because sometimes the parser doesn't work, I don't have hundreds of dozens of switches sitting in my garage or in my basement or anything like that.
contrary to
uh,
popular belief.
yeah, so my point is that many of them are kind enough to work with me to kind of make sure that the parser works correctly, a whole bunch of things work correctly, etc. So engage with the community, help make it better. More importantly, talk to others. But at the end of the day, truly it must solve a problem for you. I would like you to join, engage with the Slack channel and come
Yeah,
and tell us what problems is it not solving for you, how can we help make it better. I think that would be the simplest. So, and I've tried to make the whole thing as simple as possible. It's a single Docker container. You do Docker pull, neteng lab, SuzieQ colon, put a version number, call latest if you want to just check it out.
mhm.
And then you should be able to deploy it quite easily. The document that we have online should help you with that. If you instead want to do it with Python, we have a Python library on PyPy. It's pip install SuzieQ, and you should be able to proceed with that. And then we have a very simple sequence of steps of starting the poller, and then the CLI, the GUI, all of them should be fairly intuitive for you to use. And any of them fail, reach out to us over the Slack, engage with us, and support us and spread the word like
Yeah.
you're doing. Thank you, Eric.
No, thank you. I mean, I I remember when I first joined the Slack, it was always Dinesh answering the questions. But the last few months really is just the community. Everybody's
Yes,
very helpful. They
yes,
jump in. It's
yes,
really a helpful, welcoming community.
yes.
And also Dinesh also conducts office hours out of his
Yep.
busy schedule. He actually does the office hours, so you can actually talk to him in virtual person to ask him questions if you have any. And I asked a bunch of new questions, and I didn't feel like people were beating me down.
Oh, no,
They
no,
were very
no.
nice about it.
No, there's no reason to beat anyone down, right? It's like that old joke. That's a Winston Churchill joke. Apparently, a lady once told him, "Sir Churchill, you're drunk." And he said, "And madam, you're ugly, but in the morning I'll be sober." So, so telling somebody that they're an idiot because they didn't know something is kind of stupid, because they will find out the answer and then it's kind of pointless. You just insulted them for no reason. So I don't think not knowing something is a problem at all. So I'm very happy to have people come. It's on the second Thursday of every month, from 8:30 Pacific time till 10 o'clock Pacific time. So please join, write to me and say like, hey, here is what we want covered. I'm happy to work on trying to cover that topic for you. That's another way to engage. But more importantly, join the Slack channel and participate, because I think many people I see just file a bug report. And I heard the other day that there's a fairly big company using us. I
Hmm.
didn't know about it till somebody from inside came and told me about it.
Hey, I hear some supporting donation coming up.
I hope so. They didn't even tell me that they're using it, so I have no clue. So,
Oh, that's
you
always
know,
how the big company works, right? Like
yep, yep,
they don't tell you until they're actually sold, and now there's like,
yep,
okay, well,
yep,
how can we help?
yep,
Hopefully.
yep,
So
yep.
I
But yes,
think the community is modeled after you, Dinesh. Like you're helpful, you're humble, and therefore people take after that. Just very much how Python is modeled after Guido van Rossum, who's very strategic, very programmatic, and very humble, welcoming, and so on. So
thank you
I
for
am
saying that,
happy.
Eric. I hope to continue to embody that sense, and the community, I hope, continues to sustain me as I try and sustain the community as well.
Nice. Well, thanks again, Dinesh, for being on the show. I learned a bunch. I feel like I have to invite you back maybe a
Absolutely.
couple
Happy
months
to chat
later,
with you, Eric. Your
and
questions are very thoughtful.
we could skip all the background stuff and get right into the interesting stuff. How does SuzieQ
Absolutely.
work? How did the polar work? And
Absolutely.
we'll make it like a
Happy to
really
do a deep
technical.
dive on that anytime.
Yeah, for sure. So thanks again for being on the show. I really enjoy our conversation.
Thank you, Eric. I enjoyed chatting with you like before.
So thank you for listening to Network Automation Nerds podcast today. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and all the other podcast platforms. Until next time, bye bye.